Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm a Ukrainian Canadian. Today's May 11th, 2023. And let's get to the news happening in Ukraine, shall we? So today is a very big day because there's a lot of positive news coming out from the Ukrainian side. First and foremost, let's go to Bakhmut because in the last 2 days, there's been positive reports that the Ukrainians pulled off a great counteroffensive in the south of the city. And they recaptured about 3 to 4 square kilometers around the area of Klishivka. Now, remember that this entire area, the Russians have been fighting for months to capture south of the territories around the south of Bakhmut. And the main reason, obviously, is to get a hold of this lifeline that the Ukrainians have of the TO504 highway that leads into Bakhmut. But that was months of fighting and a lot of sacrifices from the Russian side. In a matter of a day or two, the Ukrainians just recaptured easily 3 to 4 square kilometers in one day. And the main reason, which comes out from Prigozhin, he mentioned, if I'm not mistaken, that the 72nd Russian Brigade just left their positions. And then they left the Wagner soldiers exposed, and the Ukrainians easily eliminated the remaining Wagner soldiers that were holding the line here as well. So there is a clear sense of panic going on from the Russian side. And don't take it from me, this is literally coming out from the pro-Russian military bloggers who are making their own maps, and they're also now confirming that the Ukrainians recaptured some terrain in the north of Bakhmut around Berhivka, and pushing also towards Solidar. So even in the north, the Ukrainians are recapturing territory. It's very easy why they're doing that. They're trying to encircle the Russians from both sides, in the south and from the north. And in the meantime, the Russians are still pushing mostly in the city, right? They're still pushing and putting all their efforts to recapture the remainder of Bakhmut, which now the Ukrainians barely control. It's about 10%, if not less, of the city. But there's nothing left to defend here. The entire city has been pulverized. So it's interesting to see the tactic, and I'm certain that the Russians will have to pull out their main forces here to try to patch their porous defenses in the outskirts of Bakhmut, because they're so thinly stretched that they just don't have the option now. They're going to be flanked if they don't do that. So that's that for Bakhmut, very positive. And again, if I go back to the main slides, you can see that this is a map from pro-Russian military bloggers, and they're confirming that you can see in blue, this is what the Ukrainians managed to recapture from the Russian forces. And again, they might be even underestimating the Ukrainian gains. So it could be even more. And so overall, this is looking great. And again, you can correlate the Ukrainian success by the amount of complaints that Prigozhin's been voicing for the last week, right? He's been complaining about the Russian MOD, more specifically Gerasimov and Shoigu, even calling out Putin himself. There's a clear sense of panic, in the sense that the Russians are not going to be able to defend this massive front line that they're currently trying to hold. And the other thing that confirms that today can be considered as one of those, the first official day of the Ukraine counteroffensive, is the fact that Alexander Dugin, considered as the spiritual Russian leader, mentioned and confirms that the counteroffensive has started, and that everything that Prigozhin was saying is happening exactly the way it is. And so it's either motherland or death now for all Russians. So go die for your motherland, because it seems like that's the only way for the Russians, but it seems like the motherland doesn't care about them. So what's the point? Anyway, so you can see that there's a positive trend going on, and the Ukrainian forces are really pushing on every single level, especially around Bakhmut. Now, the other positive news coming out of Ukraine is that they have received officially the storm shadows. It's kind of funny because in my last video I've kind of complained about the fact that Ukraine still didn't get them, but what's funny is that they did have them for many weeks, most likely, but Britain probably told Ukraine to not announce it, and they wanted to make the official announcement themselves. So that's great, because the Storm Shadow, first of all, has an extremely long range, and it has a range of 250 kilometers and a 450 kilogram warhead. It's a very powerful missile. It can down large structures, including large buildings, apartment buildings. So you can sense the scale of destruction that this missile has. Of course, the Ukrainian forces are not going to use them to target civilian targets because Ukrainian people are humane people and they have morals, compared to the Russians who do not have that. But the thing is that, as I've said in my previous video, the HIMARS systems last year were the game changers for the Ukrainian forces. They managed to push off the Russians and have these successful counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson by weakening the logistical supply lines, the ammunition bases, the air bases in Chornobaivka and other bases that were very close to the front lines, softening them, the Russian defenses, and then they managed to have these brilliant counteroffensives. So the same thing is going to happen this year, except these are going to be the Storm Shadows, who have a much more powerful warhead and a large range. And you can see here that they can pretty much target any Russian targets within Ukraine and even within Russia. And let's not forget that Russia has a lot of air bases very close to Ukraine, in Belgorod, in Rostov, even in Crimea, in Novorossiysk, in Krasnodar. So there's a lot of bases that they can even hit in Russia. And some say that they should use them right away against the Crimean bridge, the Kerch bridge, which I don't think is a good idea. I think you still need to give a way out for the Russians to leave Crimea. For all these pro-Russian people that are still in Crimea, you're going to see a lot of traffic lines in the next couple of days, most likely, as we're going to start seeing a lot of explosions on oil refineries, air bases, ammunition depots. You're going to start seeing a lot of activity for sure in the next couple of weeks. There's no doubt in my mind. And you can see that the Russians are having a meltdown on Twitter, on Telegram, and even in the news. They're complaining, and Peskov has said that there's going to be an adequate response from the Russian side, with whatever that means, honestly. So overall, this is fantastic news. This is what Ukraine needed. Of course, Ukraine didn't get everything they've demanded, including the jet fighters, which I think would have been great because that would have extended the range of these Storm Shadows by a lot more if you can put them on the jet fighter. I'm not 100% sure if you can do that. But, the jet fighters, you still need to have some sort of air support. It's always been crucial. But overall, as long as they have these missiles, I think they can still do a lot of damage, and they can push effectively against the Russians. So that's that for the Storm Shadows. And the last thing is, now the Russians are redefining what a victory for them is. You can see, even Putin, he was always redefining the dates, right? Last year was by, the end of April, we need to take Donbass, then it was May, then it was June, right? The dates keep changing and the timelines keep changing. And now the victory as well keeps changing, right? The Russians were so confident they would capture the entirety of Ukraine. And now it came down to Donbass and the south of Ukraine. Now it only comes down to maybe capturing Bakhmut, right? This is the level we're at right now. So it's interesting to see what they're saying now on their main propaganda channels. And so here we go. I'm going to translate, or I'm going to voice over what they're saying. The question is, what victory for us will actually look like? That will be the most important question this year, Recon. And what do we actually see as a victory? That's exactly right. Exactly right. And we need first and foremost to ask ourselves that question. Because Zelensky's objective is to get a summit, but after this whole process, but at the moment, our intermediate option is the liberation of at least 4 regions, right? Which is Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. There's no hope. They're not going to be able to cross the Dnieper River to recapture the entirety of the north of Kherson, and same with Zaporizhia, right? It's never going to happen. It's impossible. Which we've enshrined in our constitution. Right, you can enshrine, but it's kind of a half of the territory, right? They should add an asterisk that we only have kind of half of Kherson, half of Zaporizhia, and barely, half of Donbass, right? Whether that would be a victory is a big question, especially considering that initially we wanted to push NATO's borders back. So far, it hasn't worked out that way. But considering that Ukraine has never been a part of NATO, the military operation in Ukraine is in any way moving NATO's borders back. But the real issue is different, is that we ourselves don't yet know right now in May 2023 what specifically victory is and what it will look like. Which results will be considered as a victory? For Ukraine, it's clear. Or through Kharkiv, it's obvious. Why is the Ukrainian situation clearer to you than ours is? Because the objectives, sometimes they want Melitopol, sometimes Crimea, sometimes both Crimea and Melitopol. That's BS. We all know Zelensky's made it very clear what the Ukrainian objective is. It is to recapture the entire Ukrainian territory that is currently occupied by the Russians, and that includes Crimea. That is the Ukrainian goal, and the grand majority of Ukrainians are in full support of that objective and that goal. The Russians, and he's right, it's funny, but he's right. The Russians have no goal or, clear defined objectives, right, as to what a victory for them is, right? It's always redefined every week, and it's always based on, how successful the Ukrainians are, right? So at this point, that's what's confusing, is that nobody knows what's actually a victory. Is it just recapturing or capturing Bakhmut at this point for the Russians? Sometimes they want the 1991 borders, or Crimea, or Melitopol. Let me remind you that within this operation, the result which they envisage is to take a large urban center. So from that point of view, cutting off our land forces. If they cut it off, that will be a victory for them. An intermediary one. The issue is what specifically. So now we'll liberate Bakhmut, and that will be an intermediary victory for us too? Question mark. We've been liberating it for a long time. The real issue is that it was said correctly here. What will actually represent a victory for us? Anyways, you guys get the point, right? They're now at this stage where, they don't know what victory is for them, and there's no way they're going to achieve any victory because their forces are crumbling, as I've shown you. Their forces are incapable of defending, and at the first sight of heavy pressure and Ukraine concentration on certain fronts, they're going to start collapsing very quickly. As I've said, their defenses are extremely porous, their morale is very low, their logistical lines are going to be softened up by these Storm Shadow missiles and the HIMARS missiles. The Ukrainians have high morale and they're motivated to recapture everything because they understand what victory means for them. And that is recapturing all the occupied territories that are currently occupied by the Russians. That's clear, right? And as long as the Russians keep asking themselves these questions, what is a victory for us? Is it capturing Bakhmut? Is it maybe pushing into this town or that town? They're never going to win, and they're not going to be united because they're so confused. And undoubtedly, that's the default situation for them. And that's going to be like that forever because they can't get their stuff together. Anyways, guys, this is the video for today. Very positive stuff going on. I think officially it's the counteroffensive, that the counteroffensive has started officially today. And let's hope for a swift Ukrainian victory by the end of the year. It's going to be a long one. I'm under no impression that, Ukraine is going to be able to recapture it, brilliantly in a matter of 3-4 weeks. It's going to be a long grind because Russia is still a large country with a large army. But I'm very, very optimistic at this point that within the end of this year, Ukraine is going to give the final blow to Russia and set it back to where it belongs, back to Russia. So that's it, guys. Please subscribe to my channel if you enjoy my content. I really appreciate the support I receive from my audience. Thank you guys for any of those that are watching my videos. Leave me a comment about what you think about what I said in today's video, and I will see you very soon with more positive news. Take care, guys.